This Teen Writers Club lesson is going to be regarding crime fiction specifically. As always, at the end of the lesson, if you have any sort of questions or concerns, feel free to ask. You're also more than welcome to ask at any point when I pause. And if you have any suggestions for other lessons I should do, you're more than welcome. So far, for the last month, we've had suggestions that people have given, so something I'm willing to take and use. With writing crime fiction, we're going to talk first about the police officer perspective, and then we're going to talk about writing crime fiction good rules in general. So, if you're wanting to do from the point of view of a police officer, or one of your characters is a police officer, you want to avoid falling into the main two police officer stereotypes. Because stereotypes, my marker immediately died. Stereotypes are always the you can do, there we go, that works, are the worst thing you can do when it comes to characters. If you want to make stereotypes and tweak them, like for example, someone a preppy cheerleader, but they're alternatively really love bugs and rock climbing and all that crazy stuff. You know, if you want to make a stereotype different, by all means do that. But if you just want to play into the stereotype, that's when they feel a little bit just smiles. And you're like, I could reach out and touch this story, and all the characters would go and fall over. That's not what we want. The main two stereotypes that you're going to run into with writing police officers that you may fall into the trap of are either A, the I don't listen to the rules or the laws as long as I catch the bad guy. That's a good way to get thrown in jail. And it doesn't actually really exist. Do crime dramas do that sometimes? Yes, but that's because they're fiction. If you want to write them realistically, that person would get thrown in jail or fired. So if you want to write it and then have them get fired, by all means have that happen. But don't just have is totally fine with it and they press no charges. Like, no, they would absolutely be in jail or fired. The second stereotype is the exact opposite, where you have the person who is clear cut, follows the rules exactly, almost to the point of being like OCD, like if they don't follow the rules they'll explode. Like, that's also not necessarily always true. Now, are there police officers who do break the rules? Yes. Are there police officers who alternatively follow the rules to a linear, like, very succinct point degree? Yes, absolutely. But those are not the only two types of police officers out there, which is why you probably want to avoid these stereotypes. Now, the thing I want to talk about with stereotypes and cliches, any stereotype and cliche can be taken and, like I said, added a new twist, or alternatively written really well so the character still has depth and they're not just a cardboard character. But in general, stereotypes can lead to cardboard characters, so you want to be at least careful of that. Tread lightly. Don't just dive right into the stereotype, because it can cause some problems. Alright. Next thing. Make sure that your police officer has a life. Yes, some police officers genuinely, their work is their life, but most of them have a life outside of work. They have girlfriends, they have boyfriends, they have problems, they have, crazy stuff that they deal with at home. They maybe even are dealing with the fact that they are on a civil servant salary. Let's be honest, the city/state does not pay all that well. No offense to the city and the state, but that's just a fact of life. It's rough because you're paying using taxes and you only have so many taxes, and yada yada. So make sure they have a life, something else they're dealing with, something that their conflicts that they're dealing with. If the crime is, once again, they'll feel flat. They'll feel a little more dimensional than if it's, just stereotypes. But at the same time, with no life, they'll feel one-dimensional if you do the stereotype. They'll feel two-dimensional if you go a little bit beyond stereotypes. And they'll feel three-dimensional if you have them. Make sure they have a life. Alright, I will say, caveat, if work is their life, explain why work is their life. Explain why they don't have any friends. Explain why they don't have any family. Maybe all of their family got killed tragically, and so as a result, they try really hard not to have friends because anyone who befriends them dies or something like that. They believe they're cursed. You can do stuff like that, but you gotta make sure that you've built it up and you don't just have them be a random loner for no reason. They need to have a point to that. Alright, tragic reality regarding this, divorce rates are incredibly high amongst police officers. You will find more divorced police officers than you will married police officers, purely because of the fact that they work holidays, they work weekends, they work super, super long days because they finished closing a case, but that doesn't mean they get to go home early. Nope, that means they get to fill out 5 hours worth of paperwork. And so by the time they get home, their wife is already in bed and asleep. Or husband, I guess. But point being that unfortunately, if you want to build a police officer character and they do have a good relationship, explain why they have a good relationship with their girlfriend or their boyfriend or their spouse. Because the fact that this is a reality, unfortunately. Divorce and breakups are much, much more common with police officers due to the it just takes a huge toll on people. So once again, like I said, if they have a good relationship, explain why. If they don't have a good relationship, talk about how they devoted themselves to their work too much. Talk about how they wish they hadn't done that. I can't remember what TV show it was, but there was actually a really great character that was part of his character, was the fact that he had gotten divorced because he'd been so married to the job that by the time he realized he'd lost her, it was too late. She'd moved on. She was dating other people. Like it was toast, unfortunately, and he really regretted that at the time. So when he had got his new girlfriend in the TV show, he did better. Tried to prioritize more. But it's hard. It's a hard job. All right, gonna scroll down a little bit. All right. So next we're gonna talk about the common motives when you're a police officer. Now, obviously, can there be exceptions if you're some sort of crazy scientist or if you're a detective or a PI or something like that? Yes. But typically, if you're your average, everyday police officer, most of the motives that you'll deal with are anger, jealousy, and greed. So, you may have also heard this as anger, love, and money, but they've recently altered that because obviously you can be greedy about other things that aren't money, and typically it's not really love if you're murdering someone. That's kind of a little over the top. However, you also can have. So, yes, these are the top motives. However, that does not mean you can't have random accidents. These are the ones that are typically harder to solve because of the fact that it wasn't intentional. It wasn't like, hey, they purposely murdered them out of greed because of money or whatever. It's like, you made me so mad because you did this other thing the other night and they shoved them and they hit the table and they're dead. So, that can happen. There's also obviously killing out of blackmail, where someone gets really, really frustrated and tired of being blackmailed, and so they try to get rid of the blackmail by murdering the person because they don't want stuff to come to light. And that's the only other option, is to report it to the police and then have the blackmail come to light. So, unfortunately, not great options there. Generally, I would say do everything in your power not to get blackmailed. But if you're going to write something that is out of the ordinary of these, you've got to explain why it's why this is not the case. For example, if you have a serial killer or a crazy psychopath or fill in the blank other that doesn't fit these motives, that's not going to be the normal. Every once in a while, someone might run into a case like that, but that's not the average. I was actually reading a couple interviews with police officers, and one of them even mentioned, like, yeah, I don't think I ever ran into a serial killing or like a murder case that was not one of these four things ever in my career. And he had been retired and had worked for in Chicago, no less. So, like, typically high crime rate, and yet he was saying never once had a serial killer. So, yes, that can be fun to do, especially for crime dramas because it adds extra drama. Especially if they're, the type of serial killer where it's like they can't be caught or whatever. You can do that, absolutely. Just keep in mind that it has been a little over dramatized and overplayed. So in some ways, if you wanted to take one of these and twist it a little more uniquely, that actually might be better for you because your story will be a little bit more original. Not to say that you can't have a crazy serial killer, though. If you want to, be my guest. All right. Next. Most robberies are actually about these two things. Now, can there be robberies just for the money or for vengeance or things like that? Yes, but these two things cause the most amount of robberies. 80% of the time, it's drugs or gambling. Someone either owes their drug dealer money, wants more money for drugs, or alternatively has a huge gambling debt to someone like the mafia and is gonna die if they don't pay off said debt. Which is why these are the highest causes. If you have something that is not drugs or gambling and they're solving a robbery, I would say make sure that their motive is solid, whatever that other motive is. Don't make it be as flimsy as I just wanted money. Like, typically there's wanted money for a reason. There's desperation involved when you're doing a robbery. Typically you can, go get a job or work an average steady. You can even play music on the street corner and get money, right? But that's slow. So why do they need all that cash right now? That's the biggest issue with if you're doing a robbery or a heist of some sort. All right, next one we're going to talk about. Don't leave town. This is false. Police officers cannot do that unless you are arrested or a prime suspect in a case. If they are just interrogating you or in general think that you might have witnessed something, they are not allowed to tell you don't leave town. That is not something they are allowed to do. And if they do, you should report them because they aren't allowed to say that. You can go wherever you want. They should only say don't leave town if you have been arrested and are out on a certain radius. Or alternatively, if, like I said, you're a prime suspect in a case and they're like, until we solve this, you are a suspect, you gotta stay here. Those are the only cases. Otherwise, generally, this is a cliche that is overdone, overused, and incorrect. All right, next. Obstruction of justice. So, obstruction of justice is a tricky one because a lot of people in TV shows will be like, I'm arresting you on obstruction of justice, right? That's not actually that common. The reason why is because of the fact that a lawyer can get them out in a snap if they can prove that it wasn't actually obstruction. For example, if they were like, if you said, hey, I need to interview you about the crime you witnessed, and they're like, I'm late for work, can I see you at 2 o'clock instead? And you arrest them on obstruction of justice, that is not okay. That is not legal. But if they say, like, hey, I refuse to talk to you because I hate your guts and I think this criminal got away with something good, then they can arrest you on obstruction of justice because you're trying to let the criminal get away with something by not sharing. So you gotta keep in mind, if you have your police officer, detective, whoever, have the cops arrest him on obstruction of justice, it has to genuinely be there obstructing justice. Most police officers don't arrest you unless you're genuinely obstructing justice, not just saying like, I can't right now, or I'm too stressed right now, or can we talk later? Like, those are all not obstruction. Those are not a problem. All right. Next thing. Most police officers are typically not the yelling, screaming type in interrogation rooms. Most of the time, they just use nice, good old smooth talk. One of the things that was mentioned when I was doing my research was this guy said commonly one of the most effective ways of getting people who had stolen vehicles to confess, in his experience, was saying like, hey, you didn't even steal from a rich person. This person's really poor, and you stole their vehicle, and you totaled it, and now they don't have a car to get to work. This really sucks, Don't you feel bad for what you did? Why don't you write them an apology? And then it gets them to write that confession. Hi, if you're here for Writers Club, feel free to sit down. So, most of the time when it comes to crime fiction and those big fat interrogation scenes where they're screaming at each other, that's just not realistic. Most of those cops will also be charged with something because you're not supposed to scream at people. You're not supposed to slap them around. That's not legal. And they typically only get away with that if all the cops in the room, including the ones watching the videotape, are dirty. So if you want to do that, then by all means have them get away with it. But if that's not your point, that the cops are dirty and that it's all bad and oh no, then have them be more of a smooth talker. Have them be a little bit more tactful, a little bit more gentle, a little bit more like, hey buddy, I can't help you unless you tell me what you did, that kind of stuff. You don't want someone just coming in and slamming their hands on the table and being like, like, you did it. That's not normal by any stretch of the imagination. All right. Next thing when writing crime dramas, make sure to audience evidence, but make sure you do it slowly. A lot of people tend to be like, info dump, here's all the evidence. And then the poor reader's going, oh my gosh, my head hurts. And they can't keep track of it all. But if you have it slowly throughout the presentation of some sort, whether it's a show or a movie or a book, whatever you're writing, then it helps make it more compelling for the reader and helps drag them along and keep them following those cookie crumbs of, hey, I'm interested in this. But it also helps make it so that the reader doesn't feel so overwhelmed that they're like, I gotta put the book down and like make a whole crime board myself in order to figure this out. You want them to be able to see the crime board in their head slowly revealed rather than having to pull out the red yarn. If they have to pull out the red yarn, you've done entirely too much info dumping. You need to pull back. Need to tone down a little. One other thing I will say is because evidence needs to be revealed slowly, typically you don't want to do murder or anything crazy for short stories. If it's 3,000 words or less and you're writing a mystery, have it be super simple, like someone stole someone's recipe and it's obviously so and so because they're rivals. If you're doing like highly complicated crime that they've been plotting out for months or whatever, or alternatively an accidental crime and there's like 20 suspects, that is not going to make for a good short story because you'll have to rush through all this evidence. And it's just going to overwhelm the reader and ultimately make the story not feel as good as it could. So make sure you give evidence, but give it slowly. Now you might ask, how slow is too slow? If you have not given them a piece of evidence in 2 chapters to 3 chapters, I would say that's too slow. You want to give at least a small piece of evidence every 2 to 3 chapters. And I'm not saying like a big piece of evidence like they should solve the murder now, but you definitely want to give it to them every once in a while and keep up with that pace so you're not just being like 5 chapters and we have nothing regarding solving the crime. Unless in which case you're writing something that is crime drama as the secondary genre. If it's a subgenre, that's fine to take a little longer. But if the main genre is crime fiction, you should definitely make sure that the crime is the main thing. Now, like I said, if you're like doing a romance where they fall in love while trying to catch a serial killer or whatever, then you probably want to make sure that it's a little slower even than that because you're focusing on the romance. So, next thing that we want to talk about. It's okay to leave things on a cliffhanger. I know a lot of crime dramas and police dramas tend to wrap everything up all in one episode perfectly, but it's okay to leave things on a cliffhanger because of the fact that actually it takes a long time to solve crimes. If you wanted to, you could even do a whole book series on certain crimes or even have other things like that because of the fact that cold cases and things that take years or even months happen. Absolutely, they happen. Does it suck when it happens? Yeah, it does. But at the same time, cliffhanger doesn't mean it's bad. You can also have a cliffhanger if you want it to be a thriller, kind of suspense vibe. Because then you can be like, hey, guess what? This killer is still at large. They should have been able to catch them, but they didn't. There was this TV show that I actually ended up hating because the killer got away, but they ended it really well. If I was just biased because I really wanted them to catch the killer because she was crazy. But they ended it really well because basically it was the guy that they were accusing, it was his daughter. And so he ended up confessing to the crime because he didn't want his daughter to go to jail. And the whole time I was like, no, let her go to jail. She's nuts. But but that happens sometimes where people confess to things they didn't do in order to cover for their friends or family. Or alternatively, they just plain get away but due to lack of evidence or other problems. And so it's in general okay with cliffhangers, I would say. With a short story, you want to have at least a semi-wrapped up ending. But again, typically mystery is hard to do with short stories unless you're doing something very compact like stolen recipe, very quick burglary that was very obvious who did it, that kind of stuff. moving right along. So, with crime drama, the crime that is being solved should be the center of your narrative, unless it is the subgenre. Even then, it should still be semi the center of your narrative because of the fact that if you are making it too complicated with too many subgenres and too many narratives, that's when you get readers going, what's the plot again? So you want to make sure that the crime is fairly apparent. A great example of this are shows like Castle or Psych, where they'll have stuff going on that's other stuff, or they'll have romance, or they'll have really goofy, funny stuff going on. But at the same time, you know that they're solving a crime along the way. You can still see the crime moving along, and they're solving it as they go. However, you also see them doing crazy, goofy, funny stuff. And you're able to see both unfolding at the same time. All right. Next thing, let's talk about victims, whether they're dead or alive. Most people make the tragic mistake of making all victims in a story false, or alternatively, they make them out to be very flat. Where they're just like, oh, hey, they falsely witnessed this, and so it doesn't even matter. A false witness can still be important because of the fact that why are they covering things up? Or why did they missee it? What did they missee? That's still important and matters. But also, you want to make sure your victims aren't flat. Because if you just have a random person be murdered, why do we care? A great example of this was a TV show that I believe was originally a book called Three Pines. And the first season, they have a lady get murdered, and the first episode basically shows how she's abusive to her husband and her daughter, how she's a horrible person, she's super greedy, she's super mean. And as a result, when she dies, we're all like, oh, I'm so glad she's dead. But also, who the heck killed her? Because everyone had motive. She was a horrible person. So they made the victim a whole complete character first in order to help establish the crime and also to help give the story more depth. All victims were once people. Whether they're dead or whether there's a victim that was almost killed by a crazy person and got away, they're still an important person, and you shouldn't just have them be like, yes, I would like to report a crime, and then leave. That's super boring and not really helpful. But if you have a victim who's very compelling and is like, hey, guess what? I saw this guy do this thing, but I don't feel like I'm comfortable telling anyone because I could die. They know me, they'll kill me, and then you have protective custody and all these things. Like, making that more interesting is always worth it and makes it much more compelling to move forward. And with people getting murdered in particular, they have to dive into the victim's life, because if they don't, they'll never solve it. If they're just like, person A got murdered, who did it? That's not helpful. But if they say, hey, he was a really snobby businessman, and he recently stole a lot of money from these other people by skimming, then they'd be like, okay, so about all of his coworkers are probably suspects, because they'd be really pissed off that he's skimming from them. And that makes it easier to not only learn about the victim, but also to solve the crime. All right, next thing that we need to talk about is research. Because it isn't necessary in today's day and age. I can tell you as much as I possibly know about writing crime dramas. But let's be real here, I don't know everything. And so you need to research your specific crime. For example, there is a type of honey that if bees pollinate certain flowers and then make the honey, it drives someone absolutely insane before they begin to hyperventilate and die. Yep. But at the same time, that's a research thing you'd have to do. I don't even remember what type of flower it was because it's been so long since I've seen the mystery it was a part of. But you could do research on it, figure out what type of flower it is. Then you can foreshadow it too and be like, oh, I love the bees in my garden of insert flower that's evil. And then you can have the person be like, huh, that's an interesting detail. And then later when you mention that the honey is poison, they're like, what? And they can see it coming, kind of. They can put the pieces together. But alternatively, it's also important to know things like forensic evidence. A lot of people assume a lot of things about forensic evidence that just aren't true. For example, the classic hair sample. You may or may not know this, but I'm going to tell you anyway, even if you know, you probably know, because it's become a dispelled myth quite commonly. But whenever they take a little hair sample in crime dramas, they used to say, we can get DNA from this. Now they generally hedge their bets and say, we might be able to get some DNA from this. The reason why is because if you have a hair sample that you can compare to another hair sample, you can absolutely figure out who committed the crime. But most of the time, it's a random stranger, not in your database. So as a result of that, you need actual DNA, which if the hair was not pulled out or brushed out, it probably won't have skin flakes on it. And skin flakes on the hair are where we get the DNA. So if you have like someone who went and got their hair cut during a fight because of scissors, that's not going to give you anything because there's no skin flakes on that unless they have really bad dandruff. But that would be terrible comedy, but would be great. Um, anyway, but point being is that if they like snipped off the hair, they couldn't be like, ah, oh, yes, and now we have solved it because that wouldn't work. They'd have to be like, dang, these hairs were cut off and they have no skin particles on them as a result, so we can't do anything about that. Because what you want is the roots of the hair that are closest to the skin. All right, so keep in mind forensic and other types of research when you're doing your crime fiction. And if you think something is true, still look it up just because there are lots of things like that that can be updated with time. Or alternatively, like the comedian, I can't remember who it was, but there was a comedian who made fun of the fact that they were like, crimes must have been so much harder before forensic evidence because it'd be like, the killer left a giant pool of his blood in the hallway, and it's like, gross, let's clean it up, instead of being like, let's take a sample and figure out who it is. Nowadays, that would be super helpful, but that back then, it's just like, meh, who cares? Exactly, just ew, gross. Nobody cares. Um, so make sure that you do your research about also when things were developed if you're doing a historical drama, because then that way you're not saying they use blood evidence and it's way before blood evidence ever existed. All right. Next thing is you want to avoid having your characters be perfect people. I know even if you have a police officer or something like that, they are not going to be perfect people. They're going to have flaws. They're going to be jerks sometimes. They're going to cause problems. Like, they're people. And that's part of the reason why I love shows like Psych, because Lassiter is considered the perfect cop, right? But he's by far not the perfect person. He's obnoxious sometimes and really irritable and things like that, but that doesn't make him a bad person. He's just not a perfect person, which is really important to make sure with your characters. A lot of people tend to idolize cops, which even though that's great, cops are good people, they're doing the right thing 99% of the time. And so you want to make sure that you, yes, treat them like they're great people, because most of them are, but at the same time, you also don't want to make sure that you're idolizing them so much that it's like they're perfect and never do anything wrong. It's like, that's physically impossible. All right. Next thing is talking about your killer. So, if your killer, alternatively, is not doing it out of an accident or doing it out of a crime of passion, or even if they are doing it out of a crime of passion or greed or jealousy, you want to make sure that your killer has a good motive for covering it up. Most of the time, people who kill someone will call it in and be like, I just killed someone. This happened, especially if it's an accident. They'll generally call it in. So why wouldn't they? Are they panicked? Are they afraid they're gonna, I don't know, if they're in college, they might lose their scholarship and get kicked out? Did they break the rules of something that they're a part of in order to do this thing that got someone killed? Alternatively, why did they start killing people in the first place? Was it for drugs? Was it for money? Was it for gambling? So you want to make sure their motive is solid, whatever that motive is, whether it's crazy psychopathic or just your average everyday, uh-oh, I don't want to go to jail. Like, yes, you will go to jail if you call it in. True. Facts. But at the same time, what makes you not want to go to jail so badly? Just average fear of jail? Or is there something specific that makes you not want to go to jail? Like, I don't want to lose my career, or I have this fantastic wife and kids at home, so I don't want them to be abandoned, or another reason. Although panic can absolutely be one if you want to have panic be one. Alternatively, if you have kind of the psychopathic killer, or alternatively the person who feels like they can get away with anything, you gotta explain why they're powerful. Why can they get away with anything? Is it because they're super, super smart? Is it because they're super, super rich? Um, is it because they have blackmail on the police and so the police don't feel they can properly turn them in without having problems with themselves? Um, Typically, most of your crazy killers that don't get caught, um, either it's just because they somehow didn't leave enough evidence. Second, the police officers somehow screwed up and unfortunately didn't collect evidence properly or missed something. Or third, like I said, they're just crazy powerful in some other way. There's some random rich guy who's like, I will pay you all a Christmas extra bonus if you just shut up and leave me alone. Like that can happen, unfortunately. It shouldn't happen, but it does. So make sure that your killer has a clear motive, but also if they alternatively just want to get away with it, explain why they can get away with it. All right. Next, we're going to talk about dialogue. Now, this applies to everything, but especially in crime dramas, because people tend to use a lot of slang or weird things in crime dramas. Make sure that you read your dialogue aloud to yourself and try acting it out. Whether or not your acting skills are bad or good does not matter. Just read it aloud and try to act it out as best you can. And if you're sitting there acting it out going, this dialogue sounds like B-movie garbage, erase it and start over. Typically, your dialogue, if you read it aloud, will sound authentic. You can feel that someone would actually really say those genuine words most of the time.
You want to do that?
There you go. And then you have a few cliche lines too that sometimes you want to acknowledge that they're cliche lines, With dialogue in general, you want to make sure that you are also doing it age appropriate, because obviously, if you're writing a novel for middle schoolers and they're saying things like 4 7 years ago, that's nope. But alternatively, if they are like 97, they might actually talk with a little bit more elegant and big language and things like that. So it's important to keep in mind also the age of your character. I know that there was one really fun one in a TV show that my husband and I were watching recently, where they they had a witness that was so afraid of speaking out that she kept saying, "Oh yes, my bird told me this," and it's like clearly the bird didn't tell you anything. It's not a parrot; it just goes chirp chirp. It doesn't even speak. But at the same time, she felt so uncomfortable testifying, just saying, "I saw this," that she felt more comfortable saying, "The bird told me this." And so, as a result, that dialogue felt very realistic because she was this scared 85-year-old little lady. Of course, she was like, I don't want the random murderer to murder me, so I'm going to tell them that my bird saw it. And not really, yeah. And as a result, the police didn't take her seriously and things like that. There's a lot of complications that came from that. The bird was sadly not shot, but she did fall out of a window, quote unquote, later because the killers decided she was a problem, whether or not the court thought it was the bird and she was nuts. So, lots of interesting things you can do with dialogue and quirks with dialogue and characters. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is setting. Now, you can overdo this. Setting can be way overdone. If you over describe your setting to the point where it's like, we know what the bush looks like, move on, that's a problem. But alternatively, if you're just like, we are here now, where's here? Where are we? Please explain anything. That's also a problem. So you want to have somewhere in between. You want to have a basic description, and it also depends on whether or not the setting's important. For example, in the Three Pines show, they elaborately established that town because A, it was a small town, so it was easy to establish, but B, it also made it so that when they solved other crimes in seasons 2 and 3, they were able to show and establish you already know this setting from season 1. And so they established it very well. Whereas if it's like, for example, in New York City, you don't necessarily need to know every block in New York City in order to solve a crime. You can just say, it's a random alley in New York City, and most people will be fine. Most people will be able to picture something and make it fine. The only time you need to give more detail is if it's important to the crime. Like, it's a random alley in New York City, but there's a ton of garbage from this Chinese food place. And then they're like, well, we didn't find any Chinese food on her body, so clearly she was dumped here. Things like that. Alternatively, your setting can interact with your characters too if it changes and adjusts. That was something interesting in the Three Pines show as well. At one point, I believe it was season 3, they are in a large mansion, which a bunch of people who are supposed to inherit this mansion and this business. And they keep discovering new things in the mansion that help them solve the crime better. And so in some ways, it's like the mansion is interacting with them. Yes, it's a passive object, but at the same time, it almost feels like it's interacting with them because of the way you're describing things as they solve the case, which can be fun as well. All right. Now we're going to have a discussion about whether or not to use first person when writing crime fiction. So, the benefit of first person, obviously, is that you are entrenched in this character's point of view. It's really cool and really immersive. That's why a lot of people love it. However, generally, first person is writing crime fiction on hard mode. If you want to make it as hard as possible on yourself, write in first person. Not to say you can't do it, but to say it's a lot more difficult. The reason why is because most crime drama centers around, well, crime. And so if your character is not always where the crime is happening, then it's going to be boring. Or alternatively, it's going to be really, really hard because they're going to constantly be hearing secondhand accounts from other police officers or other detectives, or this random old lady is like, I saw this thing, like in that one. So with first person, it makes it much more difficult. Like I said, not impossible. Definitely seen some ones that have done it well. But it's much more difficult because of the fact that you have to have that action constantly encasing them. And that's just unlikely. Most people do not have luck that bad unless you want to have a fantasy explanation or like a supernatural explanation. Be like, they were cursed by a witch as a child, that everything bad would always happen to them. In which case, then by all means, have them always be at the crime scene. That could be actually kind of a fun story. But if you're doing your average, everyday, normal person, they will probably not run into crime all the time, which is what makes this difficult. Typically, I would say writing crime drama made easiest is third person omniscient, because then just like in a movie, you can kind of jump around and be like, here's so and so looking at this thing, and here's so and so looking at this thing. Or alternatively, you can do third person limited and then switch point of views, saying like, this chapter is from the detective's point of view, this chapter is from Mr. Bob's point of view, this chapter is from the criminal's point of view. You know, that's also very popular. I would say third person omniscient though is the easiest, because then you can also have it be removed. So then you're not having it be like, and I'm gonna tell you all of the evidence because I'm the criminal. That's a little difficult with the third person limited. But omniscient, you can just have them perform the crime and then not even show their face or describe their face, and then you're like, ooh, mysterious. All right. Okay. Next thing, with evidence, like we mentioned earlier, you want to introduce it slowly, but you also want to make sure that you introduce it as soon as possible if it is relevant. You don't want to be like, look, here's a wall full of guns, and make it super like cheesy and cliche. But at the same time, you also don't want to have it be like, and suddenly someone got shot, and it's like, there were guns. You don't want to have the reader asking a question, but you also don't want to have it be like a B-rated movie where it's just like, look at the guns that we are going to shoot now. That's bad. So, introduce it as well as can work with the plot. If they go to interview someone and they are the suspect, have them look around the apartment and be like, one of your guns is missing, and have them be like, I went hunting or something. And then that way you're foreshadowing this guy might be guilty, but you're also saying, hey, he might not be guilty. He had a reason. Granted, sometimes people are just dumb. I know one of the police reports that I was reading, the police officer was saying like, yeah, this lady like stabbed her girlfriend with a fork because she was super jealous, and then sent her to the hospital in the ER, and then was like, well, I didn't kill her, so it's fine. And they're like, actually, she did die in the hospital, and she's sitting there like cleaning the fork while she'd been talking to them. And so it was like, and she admitted it, so it was like super obvious she was the killer. Well, exactly. This is what would make a fun short story, where it's just very obvious, very goofy, very silly. Just embrace the goofiness of how easy this crime was to solve. If you're gonna do a short story. All right. Last thing we're gonna talk about is various cliches. The reason why is because, just like I mentioned with stereotypes, can you use them to the fullest extent of their ability? 100% you can. Can you use these characters and have fun with them? Absolutely. I'm going to try to, for every example, list some sort of example, unless I'm unfamiliar with this trope or cliche, to the best of my ability, that has been done well. So that way you can have an example of what's been done well. But alternatively, I also think it's important to, in some ways, avoid these because of the fact that it's been done so many times that it makes it hard to be original. And a lot of publishing houses, that is the main thing they're looking for, is originality. So if you're not careful and you're doing too many cliches, even if they're well done, the publisher might still take a pass. Moving forward with that so I can explain. Heroes with drinking and drug problems. Sherlock Holmes, anyone? Fantastic, well done, fabulous, obviously, but it has been a tad overdone now. Everyone was like, Sherlock Holmes is cool, and then everyone has a drinking and drug problem now. And even though, yes, that can happen, that doesn't mean that everyone has one. Next one is obsession with particular types of music. This one is particularly overdone with serial killers, where it's like, we walk in and there's classical music playing because he's nuts. And it's like, okay, let's move on. it's like, it's okay. Like, you can be obsessed with your own type of music, your characters can be obsessed with their own type of music. But if they're a serial killer, maybe pick a different calling card. Gender stereotypes, such as the prim and proper female character who eventually falls for the male protagonist, whether or not they're a police officer. That happens just entirely too much. Next one is the genius crime solver who is terrible with humans, or alternatively, the person who's a maverick, but for some reason they're always by themselves. Very similar vibes, but different. Again, you can do these. Are they fun to do? Absolutely. I've watched lots of crime dramas where they have a serial killer, and I'm like, this is cool. It can be cool, but it's really difficult to do well. A great example of this, in my opinion, actually is the crazy nutso yin yang lady from Psych. She actually is a great example of this, where it's like she's terrible with humans, she's creepy as heck, but she's very, very smart and very, very clever. As well as her partner. Those ones were very well done, though. Similarly, the wacky, funny sidekick who can't stand the sight of blood, once again, I'm going to do Psych. Gus is obviously that character, but he has so much more to him than that. The problem is a lot of people have the sidekick that this is their point. They're scared of the sight of blood. Oh no, I'm funny. Like, have more to you than just I'm afraid of blood. Make them a little bit more in depth. And that's why he is so funny, is because he has way more to him than just faints and vomits at the sight of blood. All right, last one that we're going to talk, well, last few. I am not at the bottom of the list. I just realized we have way more. I need to go through these a little faster. We're running out of time. Cops that come from broken families. Yes, this can happen, but that's not actually the average family. Most of the time, cops are cops because they want to do the right thing, not necessarily because their family was a bunch of drug addicts or because their parents divorced or etc., etc., etc. Yes, that can happen, but that is not the normal. Moving forward, murderer monologues. Not normal. You can do that if you want to, but not normal. Don't make it look normal. It's not. Some personal link between the detective and the murderer where they're doing it on purpose, just to them. Now, can this be done well, like in Psych, where every other detective before him had been so traumatized by the event that they had failed? Now that makes it cool because she's challenging multiple detectives. It makes it more interesting. But then when they have the personal link all the time, that's when it becomes cliche. And it's like, okay, not everyone wants to fight this guy. And if they do, something's wrong. What has happened? Why is everyone obsessed? Next one is the partner who has to have everything explained to them. So the cop who's just like, and it's like, why are you even a cop? You have the IQ of 2. Definitely not realistic. Cops generally know what they're doing. If you have to have something explained because you know the reader needs to know it, you can have other ways of having it explained to the reader that are easier, like a victim, or if they have to bring around some sort of person because they're part of their witnesses or something like that. Absolutely, you can do that. But typically, that's not useful. All right, next thing is the police chief, who's just super, super strict and super, super jerk. Not always the case. Are there a lot of those? Yeah, but that doesn't mean everyone's like that. Next one is don't do too many car chases and too many shootouts. Are car chases and shootouts a part of police work and can happen? 100%. But if you have a car chase every few minutes in your book or movie, that's a problem. Yes. Then you start getting things like Fast and Furious, where is it like, is it about catching bad guys or is it just about racing cars real fast? And yes, if it's about racing cars real fast, good for you. But if it's about the crime, let's stop doing that. Next thing is the estranged wife slash daughter slash parent who doesn't really know the victim. That makes it really difficult to solve the crime. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's okay. I have two more. But yeah. The last one is the young female that they underestimated. This one's super overdone to the point where it's just insane. They have a ton of people where they're like, hey, guess what? This person is actually the killer, and it's some like tiny little girl. And it's like, okay, yes, that can be a fun twist, but only if you've built it up properly. Like for example, with the show that I watched, they did it actually very, very poorly. I wish I could remember what it was called. But they did it very, very poorly, and that's part of the reason I was also upset that the guy went to jail instead of the girl, because they had like 7 different other people that they were like, they might be the murderer, they might be the murderer, and then all of a sudden at the last second they were like, yeah, her. And I was like, literally this whole time has not had one shred of guilt or ounce of like, I think they were trying to suggest that she was a psychopath, and that's why she had just hidden the bloody shoes in the closet and like not told her parents. But most kids, that's not the case. They're not just a psychopath who's like, I killed someone, it's fine. Like, not normal. Also, the fact that it's typically young females is a little sexist. It's like, oh, it's surprising because it's a female. It's like, really? Can't we have it be surprising and be a dude still? And then the last one is the classic Bond. Even though Bond's great and all, the classic guy who is middle-aged, who is irresistible to like 18 to 20-year-old women for no apparent reason at all. It's like, okay, like, why does this keep happening? And the age gap is like 20 to 25 years. That's a lot, I can understand if it's like 10 years, maybe even 15, but 20 to 25 starts getting to be a bit much. She's like half your age, That's a problem. Tends to be way overdone as well. Let's see. I think that is all I have, though. Oh, last one. Secretary being the secret murderer. That's also overdone. Secretary being like, guess what? I killed him because I'm so tired of being overworked. Yes, there are a lot of overworked secretaries. Yes, there are a lot of secretaries that get taken advantage of by their boss in various ways. But that does not mean every secretary is going to be the murderer. Not all secretaries are killers. Might be a surprise. But all right. Any questions? No? Okay. All right. Then I'm going to turn off the video. As always, feel free to comment or suggest in person whatever you would like for my next lesson. And keep in mind that once again, we have a contest coming up due in 2 months. So at the end of May is when that's due, and it's 3,000 words. If you want more details on that, either comment below or ask if you're in person. All right, let's get this turned off.